a lot of interest in this topic. So thanks for being here. Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to just talk quickly about what data centers are, so we're all on the same page to some extent. So data centers are essentially a big room with servers or other types of computers that store information. When we want to access information on the internet, it has to actually live somewhere. Data centers are the somewhere. So to keep all those computers running and keep that information on, all of the power has to keep the computers on 24/7, and also probably all of us have had the experience of using a laptop or a phone and you've got too many things open and it gets really, really hot. So data centers, keeping these computers on all the time, gets really hot in there. So in addition to the power to keep the computers on, it also requires cooling systems and air quality control so that you don't have dust getting into those servers. So lots of power to keep a data center online, which is why we're talking about it as Clean Power Happy Hour. Data centers have existed for a long time. They're not a new thing. They really expanded with the rise of internet usage, and the reason they've been in the news so much in the past couple of years is because of the rise of artificial intelligence and how much larger a data center has to be in order to power artificial intelligence. So there's multiple types of data centers, and we're talking about data centers coming to Alaska. We could be talking about those hyperscale, massive data centers that power artificial intelligence, or we could be talking about something that's like a little more traditional data center that might be a little more feasible for our existing infrastructure. So there's a range of different things to get into. We're going to talk about some of the impacts tonight and some policy opportunities around data centers. But I will introduce our panelists, we'll get to some questions, we'll do some questions up here, and then we'll open up for audience questions at the end. So, thank you both so much for being here. We have Senator Löki Gale Tobin, who was born and raised in Nome, Alaska, holds a master's degree in rural development, and is currently a PhD candidate at UAF, researching culturally responsive education. She was selected for the 2024 Energy and Environment Innovation Fellowship hosted by Future Caucus, highlighting her cross-partisan legislative efforts as a young state senator and her attention to climate change and energy policies. Senator Tobin is active on several nonprofit boards and cares deeply about serving the community and doing good in the world. Thank you for being here. And we also have Representative Donna Mears, who serves in the legislature for the South Muldoon District in East Anchorage. Her professional background is as a civil and environmental engineer, and she has worked on building Alaska's infrastructure for more than 25 years. Representative Mears also has a deep history of serving her community as a parent volunteer in her kids' East Side Public Schools, on multiple boards and commissions, and on the Northeast Community Council. Thank you both for being here. Can you share a little bit about your interest in being a part of a discussion about data centers in Alaska?
I figured it out. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm really happy for this question because I think it's a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about what perspective that we're coming from. It is a little bit odd because I clearly don't have the accolades that Donna has when it comes to the engineering dynamic of it. My background is in social science. I worked in the nonprofit sector. And coming to the question around why am I interested in data centers really stemmed for me something about my lived experience. And that has to do with my Peace Corps service, which is that age-old joke of how do you know someone served in the Peace Corps? They told you. It is the third goal of Peace Corps to talk about our service. But for me, I started in 2008 in a country called Azerbaijan. And when I landed in the country, everybody had these old-style Nokia phones. Do you guys remember those? Where you would press the button multiple times to get to a letter? And by the time I left, everyone had an unlocked iPhone, and there was 3G being built out across the country. And watching the country navigate and grapple with the rapid deployment of the technology, the ethical usages, where the tech was being deployed, where the infrastructure was being built, who had access to it, who could afford it, was really fascinating. Now fast forward to my first couple of years in the legislature, and I had the opportunity to participate in a program called LEHI, which is the Legislative Energy Horizons Institute. And it is a 2-week intensive graduate certificate program only for lawmakers about energy generation. And the year I was in it, 2024, everybody was talking about data centers, this rapid new technology. And the reason it was so quickly growing was because AI was being deployed in all these different spaces. And for me, that was really intriguing and interesting because I had watched as AI was first sort of entertained in my graduate program, and suddenly everybody was using AI to generate their doctoral questions and to look for new research, and then suddenly our Commissioner of Education was using it to write policies. And that was really fascinating to me. And so of course I started asking questions. I'm a naturally inquisitive person. Bill Welkowski says I might be a naturally skeptical person, not necessarily inquisitive. Because I wanted to know who was building this, who was it impacting, who was paying for it, who was benefiting, who was getting the drawbacks of this technology being built in their communities, what were the consequences? And nobody really had the answers, so I started digging more. My natural background is in social science research, so I started trying to figure out the answers to these questions. And that really led me down a path to where I might not bring the technical aspects that Donna can talk about with some of these pieces, but I come at it from a more humanistic perspective about what is the ethical and moral questions that we should be asking ourselves, not just for data centers, which some people these days call them AI factories, but about AI usage and how AI is being used and deployed and who is driving the adoption of it and why are they driving it and how is it impacting our communities. Because I don't think you can bifurcate these two things. You can't talk about data centers and not talk about AI. So for me, that's really where my interest has stemmed from and where I'm coming from in that perspective. The last thing I will say, because you're going to hear me say this multiple times, is that, as lawmakers, we don't have all the answers. We'll pretend like we do, but we really don't. And there are so many people who have better information, or they're better experts, they have better ideas about these things. But it's our job to take all the different puzzle pieces that you offer us and try to put it together to unveil the full tapestry, full picture. And that is the work that we're doing, because the reality and the bottom line is, as lawmakers, we have very few things that we are ultimately responsible for. And those things really come down to making sure the buildings are warm so you can do your work, and that the lights turn on, and that you want to keep them on because the rates are affordable, and that it's all reliable, that you can guarantee or bank on this always being there. And these particular assets might threaten that. And so I really want to be in a room with people like yourselves and other experts who are able to answer some of the big questions that I have.
Thank you, Senator Tobin. So I think that difference in perspective is really important. I'm going to throw some numbers at you so that engineer will come out. But also, the reason for the discussion here tonight is to have multiple perspectives, to let you guys know us, get to know legislators a little bit more intimately, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some legislation that I've got coming up. So I'm coming at this from a very different infrastructure development perspective. So when we're looking at the rail belt energy system, and I'm just getting these numbers in my head, some of you might know these and some of these might not have this scale. So our energy demand on the rail belt for electricity is about 750 megawatts. So that's rough, so 3/4 of a gigawatt. That's a really small system. It's a really small system. And we have overbuilt our natural gas electrical generation. So we are in the position that the Beluga power plant across the inlet that Chugach Electric owns has got 300 megawatts of additional capacity. So a customer can come in today and say, I've got a facility that needs 300 megawatts of power, and Chugach can hook them up. They don't need to buy any more turbines. They need to do a little updates to the system, but we've got existing capacity. So my driver is, I've got a long-term relationship with the Alaska Center, and putting my AIA sticker out here. I was an AIA mentor for years. I want renewables. I want Cook Inlet tidal. I want Cook Inlet geothermal and offshore wind. The scale of those projects, there's 12 gigawatts of potential of tidal, 16 gigawatts of potential out in wind. We're not that driver, because we are less than one. So how do we get that? How do we look at those economics and go, we have an overbuilt system for natural gas. How do we make those projects feasible? Forget about federal subsidies, about any legislation pointed back there. Where does that business model happen? And that comes from increasing load. I got 5 things on my list right now, which is nice because I got 5 fingers. So, beneficial electrification, electric vehicles, heat pumps, that sort of thing. It's slow and long, but that's a driver. Military, we've got a training center going on in J-Bear. It's that one's small, it's 10 to 15 megawatts, but the military is a huge driver of lots of infrastructure in Alaska. That could be more potentially. We've got mining. Mining is interesting because it's done remotely in a lot of places in the world. And if you don't have to import fuel and you're using renewables, you can use electric vehicles and electric equipment. So it's very interesting because that's an industry that very much can adapt to electricity rather than imported fuels. Future fuels, like what is that? Hydrogen, ammonia, sustainable aviation fuel. That stuff's down the road a little bit, but that's also a potential. And then data centers. Data centers are really interesting because their economic model is different. They've got different investors, they've got capital, and they want to do stuff now. So, let me talk a little bit about my legislation we've got coming up. So, all right, I would like data centers here because I would like to drive that load growth. I want to make sure that we're protecting the environment, and I want to make sure we're protecting consumers. The largest, it seems like the biggest concern that folks have about data centers is that a lot of them are vampiring off existing utilities and raising rates for existing customers because they're having to build their infrastructure out. So the biggest piece of this is consumer protection. And then the next part of it is the impact on communities. Having industrial areas that are not that far from residential areas, the hum, the noise, water use, so those are all things that are impacts. So we're looking at that, and we're looking at Alaska, and we're looking how different we are here. We're looking at, well, hey, Nikiski might be a good spot, North Slope might be a good spot, and they have very different needs. So then requiring that they have an agreement with the local community, with a community benefit agreement. I didn't come up with this, we had conversations. We had conversations with a lot of folks, including the Alaska Center, to come up with some of these things that we need. So I'm hoping we'll have more conversations, not just tonight, but in the future, to see if there's other things that we need to do and include to expand our infrastructure for energy, which should make things more stable and cost effective as we go on, as well as protect what we've got.
Wow, well, thank you. I think you touched on a lot of things I want to dive a little deeper into. But yeah, let's talk about the rail belt energy grid and our current situation. We know we have a natural gas shortage. We also know that most of our power on the rail belt grid comes from fossil fuels. And you talked about wanting renewables, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to whether you see data centers as a potential strain on the grid or a partner in developing new generation, and how you can, like if you've seen successes elsewhere in that partnership, or how we can guarantee that we're not just using the limited resources that we have and ending up with consumers footing the bill.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks, that's exactly why we're working on legislation in my office, is to do that consumer protection. But yeah, no, we are looking at the natural gas supply in Cook Inlet becoming uneconomical for development. That's the only thing I can see, point at is like there's still gas out there, but you get to the point where is it cheaper for our market to import it or to take it out of the ground? Looking at profit and risk. I haven't heard this from Hillport, but that makes business sense to me. Why they're cutting off these contracts. So yeah, that conversation of like, why do you want to bring more of a demand into a community that's facing a shortage of a fuel supply? Well, that's only right now. Like, where are we going to be 10 years from now? Where I think having that demand is going to make a project like the tidal project in Cook Inlet actually pencil out in a short term. They're only looking at like a 40 megawatt project over the next several years. But if there's money and there's demand, that can get accelerated. If we're a spot where data centers and these big tech companies can invest tidal, which is a technology that needs more time and research. If we can do that here, that helps other places other than Alaska. Yeah, we need to watch out for how much natural gas we're using, but we're looking at importing LNG. And if we've got to build a facility, it's more cost effective if there's more customers. And that's not a long-term solution. You know, folks in the industry are talking about, oh, it's a great solution for 50 years. Like, you know, I'm 54, I don't really remember 4 very much, but I can remember 50 years ago. You know, we were just talking about, my kids are, you know, on either side of 20. That doesn't seem like it was that long ago. So we're talking about, you know, like a natural gas pipeline, the time frame for that is 50 years. That's not enough for me. So if we can encourage the sorts of development with renewables, that tide's gonna keep coming in and out. That wind is gonna keep blowing. The geothermal's still gonna be there. So if we've got that demand that we can do that, we're off of that single source of energy, and we've got something that's longer term in the future. But it might mean a little bit more natural gas in the short term. And believe me, that gives me some angst that I'm promoting something that might actually encourage some more fossil fuel use in the short term, but I think the long term is there.
I'm trying not to answer all the questions I know that are on the sheet, because all of them play into the question, right? This idea of, will a data center or data centers pull smart grid? Yes, the answer is yes to that. Are there benefits to them? Maybe. I already told you I'm a really skeptical person, and I don't necessarily think there's a lot of positive information that we're seeing from the lower 48. We're actually seeing groups like Data Center Watch tell us that 90 billion projects were canceled in the first quarter of last year because communities said, no, we don't want these in our backyards, because we've seen the consequences and impacts they've had in our grid. We've seen what they're doing to our water tables. We know what the hum and the consequences might be. But if we were able to actually make the data center dynamic work for our state and use it to deploy more renewables, maybe instead of thinking about a liquid natural gas pipeline or potentially putting data centers on the North Slope, we use it to drive investment in Bradley Lake and put that, a high voltage direct transmission line underneath Cook Inlet to bring that energy here to the Anchorage area and Anchorage Bowl and the rail belt. Would that be something we were interested in exploring or considering if it comes down to some of the gives and the takes in the data center world? These are all questions that I think are really important to be asking and talking about here, especially when I think about projects that's happening like in Cordova with Green Space, where it is not the typical data center model that we're seeing in lower 48, but instead it's about an infrastructure for service model. Is anyone here familiar with the data center in Cordova? We got one guy. Yes. So they're building a data center in Cordova on top of a very premier salmon stream. And the idea is that they're using hydropower to build out this data center. It's a smaller one. It's not one of those big, football field size data centers. It's much smaller. But the idea is it's closing the digital divide. It is bringing that capacity to the community for their healthcare systems, for their school systems, to keep their computing systems consistent when they have blackouts and brownouts, because they're so disconnected from everywhere else, and they're relying on satellite, but this will help them actually have better computing power right there in their community. It's providing services for the community in a smaller scale, and it's using and actualizing more hydropower, which is putting that into the grid. That's kind of cool. I like that idea versus some of the things we're watching happen in lower 48. One of the many podcasts I've listened to was talking about how Mark Zuckerberg is commissioning a data center the size of Manhattan. Just think about that. I don't want that in Alaska. I don't care if it's on the North Slope or somewhere else. I know what the e-waste is going to look like from that kind of project. I want something that works for us, and I want to use it to drive the transition to renewables in a way that's actually going to be better for all of our communities, not just some of our communities. I'm a really skeptical person. I feel like I should say that again.
I mean, for a really skeptical person, I feel like you did just name quite a few potential benefits if it's done right. I do want to get into a couple more potential downfalls or things to look out for as we're hearing data center proposals. So first, I'd like to talk about this issue of energy prioritization. Like I said, when we were getting started, in order for data centers to function, they have to stay online all of the time. So in the lower 48, that means that sometimes the data center is hooked into a grid where residents are also getting their power. The data center is prioritized when there's limited power available. So we might be dealing with blackouts in our homes while a data center stays on. So I'm hoping that you all can talk about real or potential impacts of power outages to users in your district and how you might approach this issue of prioritization.
Start.
No.
Oh, is it not working?
I got it. So, I got it. So part of that is, no.
Just take that one.
All right, we'll just all share. Part of the answer here is that not all data centers are the same. The Green Spark project in Cordova is designed to utilize excess hydro, which they don't always have. So there's very different needs. I got to tour an Equinix data center in Data Center Alley in Loudoun County in Virginia. That's sort of like the where a lot of this came was born. They're just outside of DC. It's like something like 70% of the world's internet traffic goes through Data Center Alley. So what Equinix does, they call themselves like an airport, and it's really important that they are physically close to other services. That's not gonna be us. And then you've got a project like Green Spark that utilizes, excess hydro. A lot of that is in the contracts that's gonna be with our utilities. So our utilities need to be, and I know there's at least one utility board member here. That's their priority, is to keep their customers going. We also have the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. There's a duty there to make sure that that customers are being served. So there's mechanisms in place to do that. I'm a civil engineer, I'm not an electrical, that's not my field. I have more to learn on that about what specific equipment and rates and contract terms would be needed for that. But we've got the people around that do that. Our utilities, our co-ops, they're here to protect us in a way that a lot of for-profit utilities in the lower 48 don't have that mission. So we need to utilize our existing systems, keep paying attention, keep running for our utility boards, keep voting for folks that have those things in mind, because that's one of the beauties of our co-op model, is that we as customers and citizens have got the opportunity to put those people on those boards and do that consumer protection. We're not the only ones that get elected.
So I'm just gonna ditto everything that Donna said, because I think we're a different dynamic than they have in the lower 48, where we have folks who we elect to be our representatives, our voices in our utility boards. And it's a really important job to make sure they're evaluating these possibilities when they're considering someone coming in and saying, hey, we wanna buy this much energy off of you, to ask the follow-up questions. So I'm gonna actually take this from a different perspective based on a podcast I listened to recently, which is really about a plug for our free and independent press. So there was a Bloomberg research that just went down and was looking at the kind of explosion of data centers in lower 48, and they were asking communities, how many data centers are here? Where were they built? How were they built? Who permitted them? And all of these different industries and all these different providers kept saying, well, we can't tell you, it's proprietary. We don't want to disclose that because you don't need to know. And in some cases, even the state lawmakers had no idea, because they weren't forced or required to disclose about these poles, these incredible draws on their grid. But yet here they were dealing with ratepayers, individual residents who were saying, why is my bill so high? What's happening to me? And so it was an investigative journalist who went out and actually went to look at all the permits for backup generation, because data centers can never go offline, to figure out where all these different facilities were being built. We often call it the fourth rail of government, our independent and free press. They are so much more critical in these particular conversations, especially when we're talking about industries that aren't necessarily putting the consumers or you and I up front and center and prioritizing our needs over what their business or industry might need. I'm gonna use another anecdotal story to highlight this. I was talking to some folks from the oil and gas industry yesterday about what type of taxation system would they like to see. And of course, the first thing out of their mouth was, well, we don't want you to change the oil tax credits. Like, that has to stay stable. And I said, well, what would your employees think about a sales tax? What would your employees think about an income tax? Would they want to move here if they had to put that money into the system? And they looked at me and were like, why would we care about the answer to that? Like, because you gotta have employees. Like, how do you get the oil out of the ground if there's nobody there to do it? And I realized they don't really care about the people who work for their business. That's not their job. My job is to represent the people that work for their business and make sure that they are getting their fair share and that they are having a fair and equitable community experience, and that I'm helping protect them from the industry that they're working for. And so that's the way I think about some of these conversations, is that we have to be really skeptical when we look at a new industry, especially one that is, in my personal opinion, pushing AI on all of us so they can keep building more and more data centers and potentially creating a bubble, or maybe not a bubble, or I actually don't know because I'm not that much, I don't understand the economics of it, but they're creating something that might not be sustainable. For what? For what purpose? So there are people at the very top who make a lot of money.
I'm gonna follow up on that. Y'all shout it out, because I don't remember the group putting it on, but tomorrow night, there's a conversation here about independent journalism. So, somebody shout out who's putting that on tomorrow?
Alaska Center for Excellence in Journalism.
Excellent, Alaska Center for Excellence in Journalism. So that very conversation is happening probably in this very same room just tomorrow night. So, that's really important for all of the work that we do. This is just one thing that we work on, and I'm also gonna shout out, we've got staff that helps us, and then having conversations with folks out in the community. But the journalists that are paying attention to these issues are really important and valuable, and that landscape has changed dramatically.
Yeah, I will echo that, and it actually, what I want to talk about next is water usage, and one of the things being covered in the lower 48 is this issue of water usage and how the information is not available. And I think something like only a third of data centers are required to report how much water they're using, and so the information that we have is directly a result of folks doing hard investigative work. So would love to talk a little bit more about water usage. A medium-sized data center could use 300,000 gallons of water a day. Water is often used as part of the cooling off, as I mentioned before, important when you have a bunch of computers that can overheat. And we live in a state that has a lot of water, which some folks say is a draw for data centers to come here. And I am just wondering about concerns you might have around water usage and opportunities for regulation around that.
So I'm going to talk about it from what I found interesting. Again, I'm not an expert on this, so these are the questions that I've been jotting down to myself as I learn more about data centers. So one of the things I didn't know is that when data centers consume water, there is no reuse of the water after the fact. It evaporates, and it doesn't necessarily fall back in that same place. So when data centers use water, the water is no longer available. In Oregon, where in a community they had a data center built, and they noticed the following year that their wells had dropped 15%, it took them going through several requests for information and finally demands for information to learn that the data center was actually using 25% of the total community water use for the year. And that water wasn't coming back. It had completely evaporated. So I understand when people say, oh, Alaska has lots of water. I'm not sure I want all our water to go away, first off. The second part of that, and I think the really important piece, is not all water for data centers is usable. They need drinking quality water to put into their systems. So we might have some really great river streams and subterranean water stuff. I know there's a better way to call that. But that's not necessarily water they can use. It still has to go through the whole entire process to make it potable at the end. And that is, again, a whole nother level of energy use and industry that would have to be developed around these particular facilities to make the water that we have accessible for them usable. That is interesting to me. And that makes me wonder, well, who's gonna do all that? How's that gonna work? Who's gonna pay for that? Where does that get built? And what is the actual long-term consequence? One of the best podcasts I listen to is Shockwave. Anyone here NPR fans? Love Shockwave. And they had a really great series on data centers. And one of the things the host said at the very end is, we went through this massive industrial revolution where we just started burning fossil fuels like nobody's business. And we're really excited about all the possibilities that were before us. And it took us how many years to realize that that may not have been good decision making. The consequences to our communities, to our environment, to our planet are devastating and potentially irrevocable. We have great information about what some consequences of choices we make today, particularly about a particular type of technology that's being rapidly deployed across the planet, what the long-term outcomes might be. We might say we have lots of water today, but that might not be the case 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now. And in the position I'm in, these are the questions that we should be asking about the people who want to come in and use this resource because they say it's plentiful. Maybe that's not actually the case. Maybe we should be a little bit more concerned about if we had a data center built like the size of Manhattan up in the North Slope, what that potential water usage would be for our community and what the impact to the climate might be if it takes all that water that can't be reused later.
I'm gonna get nerdy on you with a little thermodynamics. So there's a lot of energy in evaporative cooling that does utilize its consumptive use of water. So evaporating the water, there's a lot of the dispersion of that energy and that consumption. But you can have closed loop systems. You can have closed loop systems that are separated with heat exchangers so that you've got that quality water within the system. So this is how nuclear power plants work. So they're cooling water as a closed loop system, and then they've got a heat exchanger for the cooling water that comes in. In large part, those are evaporative cooling. That's the white plumes you see out of nuclear power plants. It's water vapor. So that's there's potential there as with consumptive and non-consumptive. There's potential benefits for waste heat. And as the technology is developing, as data centers are getting more, as it's shrinking, their heat output is also increasing. So the need for cooling is also changing. But also some of those other technologies for cooling. I had to take thermodynamics twice. So it's nothing I'm teaching, but I get it enough, and it was a while ago. But there is definitely this recognition that there's like data centers in the desert. There's problems with them, with water consumption very specifically, but there's a lot. Since this is such a large industry, it is also driving technology development in other areas. So yeah, some of that's to be seen. Definitely a question that we're asking in our office. I've got like a list of environmental questions, and we've only met with a couple of departments so far. Amazingly, a lot of folks are like, well, we'll come talk to you when you're down in Juneau. And I'm like, 8 months of the year I'm available to do this work. It's like, we can't do it all when we're down in Juneau. Like, let's have some of these conversations now. I mean, so some of this is gonna happen. So Department of Natural Resources has got the responsibility for water rights. So like as if you're consuming water, then you should file for water rights, because if you don't have water rights and another project comes along and files for water rights, you could be out of luck. So there is that consumption piece there. Alaska Department of Fish and Game has got responsibility for making sure that there aren't negative environmental impacts. And the Department of Environmental Conservation has got the responsibility for the Clean Water Act. And that's my next conversation with them. So thermal pollution is within the Clean Water Act. And I've got a lot of questions for them on that. So even if it's a non-consumptive use, if there's warm water going back into a stream, what are those consequences? So they're still working on research, and if other folks have got experience that will help me with that conversation, fantastic. But yeah, there's opportunities for beneficial heat in a place where we've got a lot of cooling. We know we've got a lot of cold right now. So if we can utilize data centers for heating, that will also, if we can design them right, we can also reduce some of our need for other heating. So I know there used to be a heat loop here, the combined heat and power plant just across Ship Creek over here. I'm familiar with the building. It used to have a heat loop with the Alaska Railroad. And so they were able to use the waste heat that they weren't turning into electricity and use it for heating. So there's potential benefits there as well.
Great, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about some of the environmental impacts, the potential to hook into the grid and be a resource in some ways. And what I'd like to get to now is how do you do it? If there are public benefits that you want to capture from data centers coming here, if there are environmental protections, consumer protections, things that you want to make sure are happening if data centers are developed, how do you do that? And I know that some states have passed laws to regulate data centers, and some have done that by classifying new large users and creating new tariffs for them. So I'd love to hear about that. Other states require community benefits agreements, but yeah, we'd love to have your thoughts on what the best methods are, and what you think some of the public benefits that need to be included in any kind of regulation or legislation would be.
Well, I do want to give a shout out to the dozen or so people that emailed me and sent me text messages and slide decks of all the bills that they've seen in other states that they were really interested in. As I mentioned before, lawmakers don't have all the answers, and we really rely on you. You're the ones who feed us good suggestions, and sometimes we pretend like they're our own ideas, so I apologize for all of us. But that's really how we're gonna get through this, is you have to push yourself into the conversation because you're the experts, and you need to make sure that while you're talking to folks, you're also bringing in other voices into the room. Because we don't want to see what's happened in places like Data Center Alley in Virginia, where they're now trying to put some of the cats back in the bag. They did make mistakes where they didn't do tariffs. They didn't have user agreements. And now they're realizing that the impacts of the Black and brown communities to the surrounding environment are really detrimental. And that is actually causing this significant increase in people being very concerned and skeptical of data centers in general. I think there was an article in the ADN today that was reprinted from the Washington Post that shared that. And so it's really up to us to really figure out how we want this technology, if we want this technology in our communities, and then to really negotiate together to make sure that it's about a mutually beneficial situation and dynamic. The one piece that I think is really important in all of this is where these data centers get built. I think Virginia is a really interesting example because one of the things they highlighted is that there was a lot of promises when these folks first came in to say, let's put data centers in your backyard. There was promises of lots of jobs, there was promises of lots of opportunities, lots of economic growth. And none of those things actually came to fruition in the way that they were told they would. And one of the pieces I think is really intriguing is there were some ancillary benefits that they now have discovered. And one is many like industries co-located into Data Center Alley because they wanted to be close to the data center. They wanted their stuff to be processed faster. So as we continue to talk about this, I think we need to look at it holistically. Do we want data centers on the North Slope where there might not be any co-locating businesses, or do we want them in our communities where you might get some of these industries to relocate into Alaska to maybe put their services here so that we actually have more stability, not just the huge boom that comes from the construction, but also the lasting businesses and the opportunities that might be in our spaces to use the waste heat, to think about how we might be able to drive renewables through the requirement for backup generation for some of these facilities. These are all the ways that I think we can be really creative in creating a climate that's best for us. But I would be remiss if I don't keep reiterating, maybe we don't need all the data centers. Maybe the question is how we're using AI, and if we want to continue using this resource in this way, or potentially having the people who are forcing us to use this resource driving the narrative. I don't know about you guys, but I don't need my search engine providing me an AI summary. So there's something for us to think about when it comes to who is actually creating the demand for these data centers. Do we have to continue to participate in building more of that demand, or can we collectively say, you know what? I want the small infrastructure as a service data center in my small little community of Cordova so that we have better access to these digital informations, but I don't necessarily need all of the other ancillary things that are being built out simply so that they can find the next Google, so they can find the next major application, so that they can make more money off of it. Again, I'm really skeptical. I feel like I should just reiterate that over and over.
So we got three things here. On the consumer protection piece, that is the bulk of the bill that my office is working on. And it's super nerdy, and I've got some amazing staff that are working on it along with Ledge Legal, and I don't want to bore you, and I don't have all the pieces dialed in my head because we've been making a lot of changes on it, but consumer protection is important. So Data Center Alley is in Virginia, and Loudoun County is like, they're making bank on property taxes. And so the county's doing great. The state has got some, income taxes, corporate income tax benefits. The users in Maryland that import energy are paying for this. So this is a huge problem and a big piece of what we're looking at for consumer protection. So like, all of my bill is within the Regulatory Commission of Alaska's purview. It all has to do with protecting consumers from large loads coming in. It's not confined to data centers. Next piece on the community benefit agreement. So this is the conversation we had with the Alaska Centers and others, is so like, what are the other pieces? One of the things that I found in my research is concerns of local communities on if they've got sufficient fire protection. If they're able to like put out a battery, if there's a battery, backup battery system for a facility, if they got the capacity to do that. And that needs to be in there. I had a conversation with the mayor of the Kenai Peninsula Borough, and he goes, I'm not worried, I got a refinery in my district. So, for them, like they don't need to, have that protection for having a data center, provide additional support to their to their first responders, because they got something else that they've got more concerns about. But the next piece, so CBA, we're working on having that be a requirement in the bill. Like, I don't care what's in it, because everybody's got different needs. So having a data center up on the North Slope and having a data center in Nikiski, they've got very different needs. Maybe there's some road infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. Maybe a community wants to put in a pool and they could utilize that waste heat on a project that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Maybe there's other things that they need to do. Maybe they want local hire agreements, community workforce agreements. That's all stuff that is potential to be included in there. And the last thing is the environmental piece. It's a big part of my concern and what I'm looking at in the bill. The conversations we've had so far, where we're leading, I'm not seeing right now statutes that need to be changed. So as the Alaska State Legislature, we changed statutes. And then the executive branch has the responsibility for promulgating regulations, putting together the permit forms and the application processes. And then we get into one of my favorite things, is that we really need to support the people that are doing the work. So if you want to talk about permit reform, we need to be supporting the employees that are doing that work, because institutional knowledge is really important. So we need to have those systems in place to do that environmental protection. But I'm still doing work on that. But so far, I'm not seeing anything that needs to be done on a statutory level to provide those environmental protections. We are absolutely keeping our eye on changes that are coming from the federal government. There are changes to some of our landmark environmental protections, and we need to keep an eye on that, not just for this project, but for lots of things in the state. And that's a whole nother project, and that ground is shifting rapidly, and it's taken a lot to keep up with that. And it just might have to be something that actually gets done in 11 months, because I'm not seeing any environmental protections getting restored under the current governor. So we'll get into our democracy piece here. So get engaged, talk to candidates, and don't just choose somebody because you like what they're telling you. Tell them what's important to you too, because we only have the opportunity to know what we know. Y'all have way more collective wisdom, and we need to know what it is. So ask candidates questions, because things become issues because people bring them up. If you just have something in your little brain and you keep it to yourself, how are the elected officials supposed to know what they need to be paying attention to? Y'all have a lot of power, and I'll kind of get off my democracy soapbox for the moment, but I think it's an appropriate audience for that.
Yeah, well, speaking of our audience, I think it's time we opened up for some questions. Carolyn, would you mind doing some mic running? Thank you. If we can get this mic working. Why don't you take this one for a second while I try to get this one working?
Shake it really hard. It's like doing a theme.
Well, I have a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. I'm Roger Gale. I'm with the Environmental Center in Fairbanks. And we share all the environmental, economic, and energy concerns that the major topic of discussion get into data centers. But I think we're really short-sighted if we don't address data centers and artificial intelligence at the same time and not in isolation. You know, data centers and AI, these two domains are really evolving together. Together, they're bringing profoundly transformational change to our society and in our humanity. Now, these data centers exist, as you know, primarily to power ever smarter, ever more powerful, ever more autonomous AI systems. And the more advanced they get, the more power they need. And it's an endless cycle that we can see in the future. It's a feedback loop that we have to be really careful of. And one other point I'd like to make is that if only these rich corporations, which have been getting contracts for data centers, if only they can afford to make these data centers, and if only wealthy people, rich people, can afford access to the best computational resources and the best uploads, inequalities in our society will deepen and deepen probably exponentially. So my question to the panel is, what do you think about addressing both AI concerns and data concerns at the same time? And secondly, HCR3, the House resolution, which would require a task force that would study and make recommendations on both AI and data centers. Doesn't that seem our best means, our best vehicle for going forward on addressing both these concerns?
Sorry, tech difficulties.
It's not an AI operating microphone. Maybe it is. Maybe that's why I turned it off. I am a conspiracy theorist. Listen, this job makes me think that Skynet is overhead of us all of the time. I agree with you. I personally think, and I think there's a lot of folks behind me in the data center investigative world who do emphasize that the rapid deployment of data centers is being driven by the rapid adoption of AI. And again, it's not necessarily because consumers are interested. I don't need AI to tell me what I need to go find to make a recipe. I actually really like making lists. That's why I'm Virgo, triple Virgo actually. I know, you should ask my staff, it's a lot. But it's the situation we're in, and particularly with the current federal administration really trying to tie the hands of state lawmakers around any sort of regulatory dynamic with AI. It makes it really challenging for us. So really the option that I think we're going to have to explore, and the one that we're going to have available to us, is really around data centers. And for me, again, I'm 100% skeptical on these in a way that is really about how do we drive better community outcomes. I think there's a lot of interest in smaller, more modular data centers. I think there's a lot of interest in the idea of data centers for very specific AI applications and not on these large-scale data models. You know, I talk about this a lot with another hat that I wear, which is in the education space. There is a lot of concern about indigenous knowledge in AI systems and intellectual property in AI systems. I don't need a large-scale data model taking information from my community and trying to monetize it for people who live in Finland or Denmark. And we really need to be skeptical and consider what the full impacts on our community might be because of these systems. So unfortunately, I don't know if we'll be able to do both and with this current administration, but what I do know is we have a real opportunity to think about how we want these systems to look in our state, if we want them at all. And that is the question that we all have to grapple with. And I love and enjoy when there's legislation for us to look at and really dig into and say, okay, here's how we want to have this conversation. Let's put some guardrails and framework around it. Because just having this conversation dialogue is important, but we need to actually get down to the brass tacks. We need to actually start asking ourselves, what does this look like for Alaskans?
I'll address specifically, we covered that very well. So and I'm coming at it much more from the infrastructure, just looking at that end of it. So I'll address HDR3 a little bit. So a little quirky right now. So HDR3, the sponsor for that is George Rauscher. George Rauscher just moved from the House to the Senate. So HDR3 decides what George wants to do with it. You know, you don't run a House bill from a Senate seat.
I think it becomes ownership of the body. That is good. We'll figure that out.
Yeah, but you know, part of that is finding a champion, and it's definitely a discussion we had. It's a discussion we had in freshman caucus, like soon as we came in. So I'm in my second term, so sophomore in some ways. So our freshman class that came in was huge, and you know, like full of ideas, and AI was one of the things that we recognized was an issue that we need to do some legislation on, and it's challenging to find a champion to be able to get the capacity to do that sort of work as a legislator. We've got one of the smallest legislatures. We've got extremely complex issues. Our budget challenges right now are enormous, and I just haven't seen anybody pick up the capacity and be a champion for it at this point. Georgia's got some of that, but we don't need a task force to do that. In some ways, task forces help us channel energy and provide resources and give us a nexus around an issue, but they're not necessary in order to do that work. So regardless of what happens with HDR3, we do need to be doing that work as a legislature, and part of that is, you know, finding the champions to take that on. I'm hoping that, you know, there can be some executive branch stuff, because there's a lot more folks and a lot of capacity there. But you know, also like we don't always develop bills from our offices. You know, folks that work on legislation are you know, outside the legislative process and say, this is something that needs to be done. Here's the backup research. You know, Senator Tobin was just saying that she's gotten emails like, here's a lot of legislation in other states. So having champions outside of legislature is also it can also be very helpful with especially with model legislation when things are happening in other states. I can't keep track of what's going on in our own legislature enough, and it's really a lot to try and keep up with all the things. So outside experts appreciate it.
Okay, I think we have a working mic.
Yes.
Yay, technology. My question is really around environmental protections. You kind of touched on this a little bit, Donna, that EPA is kind of changing their focus and pieces of that. Can we include in your data center bill something that requires that they use renewable energy, or that requires that they figure out some way to use heat that comes off of the centers? How can we kind of build it? It sounds like we're in this kind of sweet spot where we can say, these are our terms. If you're going to build a data center here, it has to be under these kind of conditions. Maybe it's a scale restriction as well. So just thoughts on what sort of restrictions, especially around environmental use.
Yeah, so that's been a lot of our conversations, and you know, how do we get at things? We've been playing around with language that would require use to be renewables, and we just 2 days ago said we need to come at this from a different angle, because we're looking at it like at the contracts between utilities that are regulated by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, and not all of our utilities are. And so we've backed off from that angle, and we're like, I think we need to look at this from the independent power producers and how we go at it from that angle. We haven't found a good approach for it yet, but the first tack that we took looks like we need to do something a little bit different. So, I mean, it's on the top of the list of things to do, but like, how do we make that happen? Of course, it's an industry that says they wanna be green, you know, they wanna be there, but there's also a lot of greenwashing that goes along with that. I also got to do the Lehigh training this year, and we were at the Amazon H2Q in Crystal City in Washington, DC. And they're talking about like, you know, it's like a zero carbon facility and all that, and I'm like, but you're on this grid and this grid isn't. Well, they're buying credits from other places, and you know, that's got problems too. Like city, like Juneau is on hydro, like that's the majority of their power production, but they don't own, like, who owns those credits? Do they own those credits, or does the Alaska Energy Authority own those credits, and who's got the right to sell them? So, you know, like being green and looking green are very different sorts of things. So, yeah, no, we need to do more work on that. But yeah, it's a priority and something that we want to make sure happens.
I feel like I should channel Penny Gage. She wasn't able to be here tonight. She's recovering from pneumonia. But she sent me a really great slide deck where she showcased several states and the work that they have done to somewhat put the cat back in the bag, but also how they have required renewable energy purchase agreements. They have a bill in Minnesota and New York for this. There's bills in California and Virginia that are looking at on-site batteries, waste heat recovery, and geothermal. So I think there's a lot of examples that we can borrow from, and that's how legislation gets created. It's not just, you know, Donna's up there leading the charge, but she's not gonna do this alone. She has 59 of her best friends who are gonna help her try to get this in the best position for Alaska. And that's the best part about, in my personal opinion, being a lawmaker, is that there is so many different perspectives and people with different lived experiences that we get to sit and talk with, and that they're gonna bring up stuff that we hadn't even thought about or considered. Earlier today, because I really like to troll Bill Malachowski as hard as I can before session starts, I was asking him, well, first I was telling him some really offensive jokes, but then afterwards, I asked him, turned out his pipes are frozen, and he was just letting me go at him the whole entire day. I'm sure his day was terrible. But I was asking him, why would we prioritize a potentially $44 billion to $70 billion liquid natural gas pipeline over 800 miles of tundra versus a $1 billion build out of Bradley Lake? Like, why would we pick one or the other? And he said, well, have you thought about how we're heating our houses? I was like, oh, darn it. Forgot that we're all using natural gas to heat our houses. Ah, Bill. But that's a really good insight that he provided me that I hadn't even considered. All I was thinking about was the electrification and not about how I just built my house and we built it around natural gas because we were told that was gonna be the cheapest option. We put in-floor radiant heating with a natural gas boiler because we were told that was gonna be the most efficient system that we could put into a new build. Turns out that was a terrible idea. But I didn't know that 4 years ago. And so now here I am having to navigate this, and I don't want to have to retrofit that system at my dime because I really want to get Bradley Lake. And so it was an interesting conversation and thought process to realize this is why we're all working together. We're all going to roll up our sleeves and try to figure out what is the best bill for Alaska? What is the best way forward for Alaska?
We have another audience.
Hi. Yeah, go on. So this is a bit of a question for Donna, just because you touched on it earlier. One of the things I'm a little concerned about, just fiscally with everything else, is there's a lot of money flowing out of state for controlling interests in Alaska right now. We're seeing that with policy. We're seeing that with different offices and real estate. Different things kind of like that. You mentioned that we kind of have a lot of protections that we need, but do you feel like we're sufficiently protected at this point, essentially from, not necessarily hostile, but if Amazon were to say, hey, we want to develop an AWS cloud computing setup up here, do you feel like we're sufficiently protected, I guess, from someone forcing their way into the state?
Not yet. So there's nothing preventing large data centers from coming up here as right now if they can find the electrons to do it. So this is the work that we're doing, is to provide that protection. But this is also one of the things about being a resource extraction state. And, you know, part of my thoughts on, you know, like what are load drivers is like how do we export our energy? And, you know, looking at, you know, alternative fuels, that's a way to export our energy. We've got more energy than we can utilize here. Our market isn't large enough. And sending it out as information rather than a fuel source is just another way that happens. And, you know, just part of that resource extraction state question.
That was like real sad, like walking.
Sorry.
Sorry. We're working on it.
Yeah.
I think I want to take maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. So if somebody has a burning question, otherwise we can kind of great in that way.
Oh, no. He's gonna ask a labor question.
Thanks for the interesting discussion tonight. So my name is Alex, I work for the Alaska AFL-CIO. We've spoken with organized labor movements with some of the other states that have data center legislation. I think there's 38 out of 50 right now that have it. And some states have cut pretty poor deals. Mears touched on that. And some states, in the opinions of our labor brothers and sisters, have cut pretty good deals. They've seen some benefits for the communities, for the states they live in. So I guess my question is, what is the price? We have a fiscal cliff here in Alaska. Is it 500 jobs and 150 million in our general fund? Is it double that? You know, it's a zero-sum game in my mind. AI is not going to go anywhere, and the kids in Washington or Oregon, you know, they might get free lunch. They might be in a classroom size of 20. Their teachers are going to have pensions. They have pensions already. They're going to have better pensions. Their universities are going to be funded. So what is our price, so to speak? Because we're running out of answers, and we don't see a whole lot of political will in June. Thanks.
No, Alex, that is a great question, and I think it's the one we have to be asking ourselves. Because as you say, they're not going anywhere. So what is it that we want to get out of this conversation, out of this dynamic, that's going to benefit us? And that's where I keep thinking about, it can't be just about the short term, because you think about some of the things that we've made agreements on that benefited us in the short term. We saw huge increases in our population, we saw huge builds out of technology, we saw huge assets developed, and then we're left as Alaskans holding the bag when all that goes away. And it's you know, we can go far back. I grew up in Nome, where there's a bunch of railroad spurs everywhere. There's a bunch of e-waste littering our landfill that's not managed, that's poisoning the tundra right now. And that is a real cost. And it's a cost that people wouldn't be talking about when they were putting those things in. It's a cost that we're dealing with today as Alaskans who are living here. So it can't just be about the short term. We really do have to think about it from a long-term perspective, but it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where there's winners or losers. There are really great things, like I've mentioned in Cordova. There are ways to build out some of these facilities that are really about infrastructure as service. There's also other things like in Finland, where they have data centers that are actually doing the waste heat recovery, they're using seawater, and they're providing those 300 stable, permanent jobs in the community. And hopefully there's gonna be co-locating services that bring more permanent jobs into the community. We could build a system that benefits that incentivizes that, versus what I've had some folks really pressuring me on, which is about these large monstrosities built on the North Slope that use natural gas, that actually isn't about building the infrastructure up for Alaskans and local communities. That's not about making sure that we have better transmission lines in our communities. It's not about making sure we have jobs that are sprinkled across the state. I tend less toward that idea, but that's just me, and I'm one voice. And maybe someone will make a really salient argument that challenges those beliefs that I currently hold.
Not quite sure how to top that. So. Where to go in conclusion? So, you know, so what I'm looking at is, you know, since I'm looking at data centers as one of a load growth, you know, in our limited market, as an opportunity to reduce energy costs, and you know, with many extraction type things, with our oil and gas system, like there's a lot of upfront labor, so there's construction labor, and then the actual operations of things is much less. It's interesting, I had a conversation with, I think it's the American Hydropower Association. They were up here for a conference this year, and I was talking to one of their guys, and I'm like, you know, about about tidal energy, and he's like, why are you interested in data centers? There's not a lot of jobs in data centers. And I was like, yeah, but if they can bring the energy costs down, then all these other businesses that can't survive with high energy costs can live. I'm starting to see a lot of people talk about what their bills are right now, their heating bills and their electric bills. We had a presentation from, legislators had a presentation from NSTAR today. Their highest use day ever was last Saturday. So there's gonna be a lot of people, if their bills coming due right now are really questioning, what are we doing about energy prices? And, that's got a huge potential. And if we're just importing LNG and getting faced with higher and higher energy costs, that's a huge economic problem that we're just gonna keep facing as other costs rise. So, in order to have a strong economy, I think we need cheaper energy, and you've got that potential. And how do you make that happen? Some of it we can try and mandate, but it looks like the driver is gonna be economic development and not doing stuff as we told you to.
Great, thank you for your thoughts on that. It's definitely top of mind is what are the actual benefits to Alaska that we can capture and should be looking to capture, so appreciate those thoughts. I want to ask you for any closing things you'd like to share, whether that's any other considerations about data centers, what you want people to be thinking about moving into the legislative session. And I also want to let folks know that we at the Alaska Center have been thinking about and learning about this quite a bit, and we have been working on a white paper that will be available soon so that we can share the resources that we've started to gather. So I'll let you close with any thoughts.
Well, we were preceded with what the last question might be, and so I asked my husband last night because I had an idea of what I wanted to say, but sometimes I can talk for a really long time and never really get to the point. So he helped me write it out, so I'm just gonna read it. So when he shows up here in a few moments to take me to dinner, you can all be like, great question, Walker. But the question really is like, what's the number one thing I think you all should be looking when trying to evaluate a data center proposal, or when you're just asking people about data centers? And what I wanna be really clear about is the data centers have their advocates. There's hundreds of podcasts on Apple Podcasts that are all pro data center. There are lobbyists in our office. There are large corporations that are coming and telling us that we have to do it this way. They have their special interest groups that are looking out for their interests, who are making sure that they get theirs. So you need to know, or you need to ask, who is your representative, who is your senator, who is your local elected official, and once you know who those people are, make sure you get their name and their email, and then you need to start engaging them. Because our job is to look out for you. Our job is to fight for you. Our job is to protect your interests. I'm not here to make industry more streamlined and make more money here in Alaska. I'm here to make sure that we get something out of it for Alaskans so that we lift everybody up, so that it's a mutually beneficial situation. I'm not here for the billionaires, I'm here for the working class Alaskans. And that is the thing that I think you should be asking in this conversation. Who's fighting for me and who's making sure that I am protected in this conversation?
I'll kind of go off from that on protection. So for me, for my personal goals for this session is making sure that we're not overbuilding our infrastructure, so that we're not building 2 LNG import facilities that customers are paying for, one for their electricity and one for their heat. That we're not building a pipeline from the North Slope that doesn't have international customers, that Alaskans are gonna get stuck paying the cost. And these are not necessarily conversations that are, happening with some of my colleagues, which is really shocking. But it's important, and I am really grateful that I've got the space to be able to be asking those questions and demanding those answers, and sometimes have the ability to actually do something about it. Not every day can we do the things that need to be done, but there are those days. I'm grateful to have them. I'm grateful to serve. I'm grateful to have partners in the legislature that are there doing that work with me. So let's keep bad stuff from happening and get some good days from time to time.
Well, you can help us keep bad stuff from happening by signing up at the front table. Thank you all so much for being here. We will keep you posted on what's happening.